everyone. Good morning, everyone here at the NIKI and those who are joining us online. Welcome. My name is Kwakkelstein. I'm the director of the NIKI, and it is my great pleasure to introduce you to the organizer of this today's workshop. And I will begin with Mandy, Richter. I will first introduce you, and then Mathilda. Mandy Richter is collaborator of the director's office at the Kunsthistorisches Instituut in Florence, the Max-Planck-Institut. She has been a fellow at the Scuola Normale Superiore, PISA, art history, and received a doctorate degree in art history from the Technische Universität Dresden with a PhD entitled Die Renaissance der Kauenden Venus, ihr Nachtleben zwischen Aktualisierung und Neumodellierung in Primo Cinquecento. Following the publication of her PhD by Rassowitz Verlag in Wiesbaden, she edited together with Anne Bloemacher and Marcia Fayetti the volume Sculpture in Print, 1480-1600. That's the first in-depth study dedicated to the intriguing history of the translation of statues and reliefs into print, and that was published by Brill in 2021. 2 years later, the collective volume Indecent Bodies in Renaissance Visual Culture was published by Amsterdam University Press. To this volume that she edited with Fabian Jonietz and Alison Stewart, she contributed with an essay entitled To Show or Not to Show, Marcantonio Raimondi and the Representation of Female Pubic Hair. This topic, though not limited to the work of Marcantonio Raimondi, Dr. Richter delivered a paper in Chicago at the 2017 annual meeting of the Renaissance Society of America. And now I'll turn to the other organizer, Mathilda Blanquet, and she holds a position at the as a research and teaching assistant at the Berlin University of the Arts, Universität der Künste, and is pursuing a PhD in art history at the universities of Toulouse and Hamburg, supervised by Frank Fehrenbach and Pascal Julien. In her dissertation, entitled The Artifice of Decency and the Erotization of the Body in 16th Century Italian Sculpture, she examines the aesthetic and cultural implications of the precepts of decency in the representation of the artistic nude. More specifically, she investigates the tensions between concealment and suggestion, as well as the visual strategies through which Cinquecento sculpture articulates modesty, sensuality, and transgression. Mathilda is specialized in Italian sculpture of the 16th and 17th century, mostly in Florence and Rome. Over the last year, she has published several papers on nudity and violence in Florentine sculpture, appearing in collective volumes. Together with Juliette Superby, she edited Corps et Pouvoir, Mise en scène du corps dans la représentation politique, and this is a 2-volume publication devoted to the representation of the body in pre-modern political imagery, containing the proceedings of a conference held in Toulouse in 2021. The first online volume has just been published within Le Carrier de Framspa, I hope I pronounced the collection Historia, and the second is expected to appear in December. Mathilda has been awarded grants and research fellowships by the Académie Française in Rome, at the University of Hamburg, and the University of Toulouse, Jean Jaurès. And in 2023, you were a fellow here at the NIKI, working on your dissertation, and it was at that period that, following discussions also with you, Mandy, that the idea for this workshop was born. So thank you very much. And the floor is yours, both of you.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Michael Kwakkelstein for this introduction and offering this opportunity to organize this workshop here at the NIKI. More generally, Mandy and I would like to thank the Friends of the NIKI and the University of Utrecht, whose generous support made this event possible. Our warmest thanks go as well to the entire NIKI team, Gert-Jan van der Sman, Ilaria Masti, and Lex Kuil, for their invaluable help and kind assistance, actually. This workshop was co-organized actually in close collaboration with Lex, who has taken great care of all the logistical aspects, as you can notice. And thank you very much, Lex. We also wish to thank Daphne Dane for our technical assistance today. So, body hair as a topic, actually, has actually emerged indeed from the intersection of our respective research with, together with Mandy. Mandy, as you heard, has already worked and published on the presence of pubic hair in engraved depictions of the female body. What? All right, sorry. And here we are. So, of our, please excuse me. So, as I said, Mandy has worked and published on the presence of pubic hair in engraved depiction of the female body, showing how these subtle or suppressed details participate in a genuine politic of visible and desire. As for myself, my research on potentia in the male body during the Italian Renaissance led me to consider the presence or absence of body hair, particularly pubic hair, actually, in 16th century Florence. And actually, I'm mostly focusing on how these elements contribute to the construction of visible virility in political context. So our approaches therefore complement each other's. Mandy focusing on the female body and printmaking, and myself on the male body in sculptures. And this difference is not only thematic, but also material. The medium itself determines the possibility of representing hair. In sculpture, for instance, and particularly in Florence and in Florentine work, we observed while we were together at the Bargello, gathering some ideas for this workshop, we could observe that female hair, female body hair, thank you, Mandy, beyond the hair were actually non-existent, whereas male pubic or armpit hair may simply appear as a sign of virility or potency. The male nude could display body hair as a sign of virility, while the female nude had to erase it in order to remain ideal. The hair that appears or disappears thus reveals the gender politic of visibility. And through these parallel perspectives, we became aware of how layered and revealing the topic truly is. Hair in art is never just a naturalistic detail. It crystallizes religious, moral, political, and aesthetic meanings. That's your
turn. Nowadays, it is abundantly clear what an important role hair plays in general in everyday life. And this does not only apply to women. The same is true of the early modern period. Countless objects or documents in connection to all kind of hair on the head, facial hair, as well as body hair, have been handed down to us, and which tell us of its importance in everyday life. We know, for example, about adventurous recipes for or against hair growth, new inventions to dye or to lighten up hair, like this Venetian sunhead. We know of wigs or other hair pieces, up until artfully crafted objects such as combs and razors. To approach the topic, let us first have a brief look at the social history of hair. Hair, and this includes also body hair, has been and is still connected to questions of identity, which does not only refer to the individual one, but extends as well to affiliations with certain groups or even to intentional distinctions. Think, for example, of tonsures of monks or the ritual sharing of the hair of slaves. Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish, when talking about the relation between power structures and the body, created there the term of the docile body, which was later termed like the political body, and demonstrated how this body is regulated by political structures. Even if not explicitly mentioned by the author, Hair is part of such questions of subordination or resistance. Applying Foucault's ideas to the female body in everyday life, Susan Bordeaux emphasized the body as a medium of culture, or as a metaphor for culture, calling it a site of struggle, in which cultural ideas, but also contradictions become visible. And in that way, she underlines the social body. We could also mention here Judith Butler's lines of thought on gender performativity and the individual body there. According to Butler, hair's meaning is always a product of culture and determines gender. The styling or even the removal of hair is strongly shaped by societal norms, so Butler, and in the same way contributes to them even when going against the tide. In this sense, the term hair literacy, as developed by Stefan Hans, seems quite fitting for all the information that we can get out of hair. Particularly in the last about 30 years, the topic of hair has gained more and more relevance as a research field, most of all in the context of the body term. The series, A Cultural History of Hair, with its 6 comprehensive volumes, is certainly the current standard work on hair issues. Numerous other publications have appeared, of which most recently I would like to name only a few. We have Emanuele Lullis Notes, the volume curated by Martin Mulso, Das Haars Argument, or Julia Saviello's Verlockungen. But there would be many more to name, for example, publications on beards, or even on the connected topic of skin. Reference should also be made here to 2 recent exhibitions on hair, Des Cheveux et des Poils in 2023 in Paris, and Le Trecce di Faustina in the same year in Vicenza. While the Paris exhibition focused also on the topic of body hair, it remains only marginally mentioned in a cultural history of hair. Could it be that more studies are devoted to head and facial hair because of its greater visibility? The anthropologist Anthony Sinnott saw this visibility as a sign that hair of the head and beards are rather public than private. Would body hair then be rather private than public, and thus be subject to different rules? What happens then if body hair becomes visible in artworks? We will certainly explore these questions further. When it comes to medical explanations of hair or its appearance, in the early modern period, Aristotle's or Galen's lessons on hair, in which they considered hair an excrement of the body, were still of importance. They explained that substances from within the body are excreted through the skin, and as soon as they are outside of the body, they lose their moisture and become then what we see as hair. The individual appearance of hair, including its color, the amount of hair, but also its thickness and where it grows, depends all on the humoral complexion, as well as on the skin and on the pores. For example, according to Galen, and here he explicitly refers to body hair, isolated or excessive hair growth indicates an imbalance in the humoral fluids. Next to such medical discourses, hair played an important role as an ornament. This is also why beauty treatises became increasingly widespread in the 16th century. They provided further instructions on how to care or how to manipulate its appearance, on which, for example, Jill Burke has extensively published. Such treatises included, among others, recipes on how to dye or to remove hair, or even on how to fight hair loss, which in some cases could include adventurous ingredients such as bad brains or bear fat, up until combustible or even toxic mixtures. Next to the aforementioned rather negative medical explanations of hair, it has also been seen in connection to its owner and as a sort of pars pro toto, and was or even is therefore in some cases venerated as a precious object. There is, for example, the hair that Albrecht Dürer, here on the left-hand side, is said to have bequeathed to Hans Beilung, or that of Lucretia Borgia on the right-hand side, known for its beautiful color. Hair relics have also been preserved for various saints, such as this from Santa Chiara in Assisi, or the various relics on the Prophet Muhammad. However, what will be of particular interest to us over the next 2 days is hair in early modern visual culture. Do the aspects mentioned above find their way in the same form also into art? Are there perhaps intrinsic rules in the visual arts with regards to the depiction of hair? Here too, hair is applied to express identity in the sense of affiliation or distinction, but it may also be a sign of categorization, as mentioned before. Nevertheless, this workshop will attempt to go beyond such simple binary thinking, male, female, old, young, and highlight instead nuances or even deviations from such categorizations. Particularly in the case of the depiction of body hair, the respective contexts of the illustrations are essential for its interpretation. For example, there are well-known works of art, such as Marc-Antonio Raimondi's Massacre of the Innocents, in which, admittedly only at second glance, body hair, in this case male chest hair, becomes visible. Compared to Raphael's preliminary sketch here on the right, it becomes clear that this is most likely an addition by the printmaker. This can be demonstrated by comparing it with other prints from Marc-Antonio Raimondi from around 1510, in which the printmaker also adds body hair. It is exactly in those years that Marc-Antonio had a closer look at the works of Albrecht Dürer. Of particular importance was the print with Adam and Eve, to which made Marc-Antonio change his approach in the depiction of both the male and the female body. But next to representations of nudes, many depictions of monstrous figures, here Baccio Bandinelli on the left, or figures that are supposed to deviate from the idea in some way, often feature body hair. Examples include images of wild men or foreign people, as can be seen here in the example by Lucas Cranach the Younger. Furthermore, numerous depictions of Christ are also deliberately shown with body hair, to which we will hopefully return to in one of the presentations. The example here is from the 15th century and is notable for its sculpted armpit and pubic hair, and thus referring to Christ's human side. As we concentrated so far on strong hair growth, the absence of hair will also be a focal point. Compared to the aforementioned depictions of Christ, it is striking that some of the tormentors in the flagellation of Christ visibly suffer from a complete or a partial hair loss, as to be seen here in the works of Piero della Francesca and Luca Signorelli. In these cases, it is probably the connection between hair loss and the aforementioned imbalance of the bodily fluids, which is significant for the depictions and which perhaps goes hand in hand with the negative interpretations of the figures themselves. We should also briefly mention the depiction of hair as curiosita for scientific purposes, as here in Ulissa Aldrobandi's reproduction of Gonzales and one of his children. The Gonzales family suffered from hypertrichosis and excessive growth of hair on the body. Pedro and his family are probably the first documented case of this disease in Europe, of which numerous documents are still known today. This sheet, the facial hair with its masterly application, seems almost to be the protagonist of the page.
And finally, the question of the medium remains essential. The visibility or erasure of body hair varies greatly between print, sculpture, and painting. Each medium brings its own materiality, audience, and circulation, which determine whether and how body hair could appear. A marble statue, a print, and an oil painting thus belongs to distinct economies of visibility, intimacy, and censorship, all deeply linked to gender ideals. As I already said earlier, while we were at the Bargello, we could observe a contrast revealing a broader visual economy. Male body hair, especially facial, male body hair, especially facial, or pubic, was not only tolerated but often celebrated, becoming part of a discourse on virility and artistic excellency. Around 1500, the presence of male pubic hair was considered integral to the naturalistic ideal of the nude, contributing to its realism and the glorification of the virility. By contrast, female body hair was almost entirely erased, while the hair on a woman's head became a privileged locus of representation and eroticization. Her body was rendered as an unbroken, polished surface. The sculpted flesh thus stages a deliberate act of omission, what Anne-Sophie Lehmann has called a non-representation of the female genitals and pubic hair, translating the ideal of feminine beauty into a material smoothness that signifies both modesty and ideality. Depicting hair, fur, or beads was for sculptors a way to demonstrate virtuosity. The realistic rendering of textures allowed them to demonstrate virtuosity, and the realistic rendering helped to display technical mastery while heightening the haptic dimension of sculptures. And this actually helping the spectator to engage with the sculptures through the process of Entfüllung. Hair also introduced movement. So Alberti already in the Pictura celebrated this expressive mobility, describing how hair should move in circles, twist upon itself like flames, weave like serpents, and turn upward or downwards as the wind blows. A century later, Vasari, speaking of Michelangelo's Moses, praised precisely this illusion of vitality. The beard, long and curling, is carved so finely that the iron seems to have turned into a brush. And again, almost a century later, Orfeo Boselli in the 17th century refined this idea further, noting that the greatest artifice lies in presupposing a little breeze that dishevels beards and hair with grace, always pushing them slightly against the turn of the face, as we could see here, a witness with a representation of Oceanus and Neptune. These three perspectives, Alberti, Vasari, and Boselli, all converge on the same idea that movement and vitality emerge through the treatment also of hair, and not only draperies or movements. In that sense, the representation of hair operates as a testing ground for sculptural genius. I have to come back here. Yet, the ideal of the hairless body is not limited to female figures. It often applies to androgynous body as well. In the 15th century, the glabrous body still signified innocence and purity. Donatello's David, for instance, is nude yet childlike, and Palmieri noted that pubic hair appears precisely when these zones of the body became shameful. But his sensuality or erotization actually occurs not through hair, but through the tactile gesture itself, the feather that carries his scythe, or Goliath's bird brushing his feet, and this exactly through the process of empathy, depending on the haptic effect of the sculpture. A striking comparison can also be made through the work of Bertoldo di Giovanni. His polychrome wooden Saint Jerome, sometimes co-attributed to Donatello as well, recalls naturalism close to that of the Marie Magdalene. In both figures, the body and facial hair are not erased but emphasized, functioning as markers of asceticism and physical truth. But one can see also quite of a contrast when we compare Bertoldo's shield bearer with his Orpheus. The shield bearer presents a virilized ideal of masculinity defined by the realistic depiction of body, pubic, and facial hair. By contrast, the Orpheus embodies a glabrous, almost ephebic androgynous beauty. It's a purified and sensual body where the absence of hair serves the ideal of decorum here. And this example shows actually how in sculpture, hair, whether present or erased, participates in defining moral and gender identities. We have a particularly revealing case in Baccio Bandinelli's wax modello of Hercules, kept at the Rhode Museum in Berlin, where pubic, armpit, and even chest hair are actually clearly rendered. This emphasis on the bodily hair underscores sculpture concern with physical power and naturalism, which is a corporal truth that verges on the excessive here. And through wax, actually, a medium already associated with flesh, Bandinelli could explore the tension between idealization and realism in ways marble would later restrain. In contrast, also, the Herculean male body remains a primary space where hair is fully assumed. Even armpit hairs, so rare, actually, mark the threshold between idealization and realism. This will to show mastery through the rendering of textures also manifests through animal fur and hybrid surfaces. Think, for example, of Michelangelo's Bacchus or Vincenzo de Rossi colossal sculptures of Hercules here at the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. We can see in the case of the Bacchus how he's holding the panther skin or the Satyr's furry legs, and the sculpted hairs thus oscillate between the human and the bestial here, between decorum and excess. Prince, however, follows another logic, of course. Here, the nude body is often depicted with far more naturalistic hair. The reason lies partly in the medium's scientific orientation and in its mode of circulation. Prints were more intimate objects, less constrained by the moral expectations that govern sculpture, especially in a public space. And they allowed for a level of anatomical precision and transgression to that extent, thus marble could actually not afford. In Dürer's self-portrait, for example, or in Raimondi's engraving of the female nude, we find a frank empirical attention to body hair, not hidden, but studied. And the printed line, more than the sculpted chisel, could render her as a site of knowledge rather than shame. At the same time, Renaissance culture also associated body hair with a demonic or subversive power, especially in the case of women. Women accused of witchcraft were actually often shaved before trial, as if to erase the seat of this dark potency. In contrast, the hairless, pure body was seen as a sign of innocence and virtue, as we could see earlier with the David of Donatello. And the dialectic between the glabrous and the hairy thus mirrors a deeper moral tension between decency and desire, purity and danger, civilization and the animal within. And this mark of sexuality, standing in opposition to the civic ideal of decency, becomes even more explicit in painting, particularly in Northern European production. In Hans Baldung's Two Witches or Luca Cranach's The Elder, a faun and his family with a slain lion, as you can see here, the virility of female pubic hair functions as an unmistakable sign of sensuality and erotic transgression. It points to the boundary between moralized nudity and carnal desire, revealing how in the pictorial realm, the presence of hair becomes a vector of sexual meaning rather than a flaw to conceal. This question will be further explored throughout the different presentations structured around four main themes, which are norms and beyond, different notions of body hair, hairy and furry, of beards and bearded grapes, body hair in religious representations. And I would like now to welcome Katharine Stahlbuhk, who's gonna moderate the first panel. Thank you for attending.
Good morning, also from my side. It's my pleasure to chair the first session in this conference where hopefully no hair will be too fine to split. So let's start with the introduction of our first speaker, Natasha Seaman. Natasha Seaman is Professor of Art History and Chair of the Department at Rhode Island College. A specialist in Northern Baroque painting, her research focuses on religious imagery, materiality, and artistic processes in 17th century Dutch painting. She is, inter alia, the author of The Religious Paintings of Hendrik ter Brugghen, Reinventing Christian Painting After the Reformation in Utrecht, published with Ashgate in 2012, and, for example, the co-editor of Embodying Value, Representing Money in the Early Modern Period, Amsterdam University Press, 2022. Her paper today, as you can see on the screen, Male Body Hair as a Disruption of the Classical in Early Modern Art, examines how depictions of male hairiness in works by Dürer and Valentin de Boulogne challenge classical ideals of beauty and form. Please join me in welcoming Natasha Seaman.
Thank you, Katharine, and thank you, Mandy, Mathilda, and NIKI for the opportunity to talk about this subject, which has always been extremely interesting to me, and I was absolutely delighted to see it as a call to viewers. In a pair of engravings depicting the martyrdom of Sebastian, both dating to around 1500, in close but not identical in size, Albrecht Dürer represents the saint in contrasting ways. In one, Sebastian is tied to a column. In the other, he is tied to a tree. Column Sebastian stands in modified contrapposto. He is clean shaven, and a tumble of well-behaved curls frames his face. His elegantly curved torso is hairless, and a swath of cloth conceals his genitals. What can be seen of his pubic mound is smooth, as are his legs. By contrast, tree Sebastian's arms are tied above his head, and he seems to have swooned backwards against the tree for support, his knees falling open. Rather than classical drapery, he is wearing a variation of the contemporary linen male undergarment, and a scrim of darkness appears above it, suggesting pubic hair. He is bearded, and his hair is a mass of unruly curls. What is most striking for our purposes, however, are his legs, which are hairy, a feature clearly silhouetted against the white background behind him. The story of Sebastian was best known through Voragines' Golden Legend. According to this text, he was a member of Diocletian's Praetorian Guard and secretly a Christian. Once his faith was discovered, he was sentenced to death by a rain of arrows, which he survived, though he was later beaten to death and his body thrown in the Cloaca Maxima in Rome. His survival of the rain of arrows, an attack that was seen as a symbol of contagion, made him a popular plague saint, and his image proliferated during outbreaks of the disease in the early modern era. Sebastian's intercessory role strongly identified him with Christ, which meant that his depiction often alludes to the crucifixion and Christ's passion. In broad strokes, these two depictions of Sebastian relate to the two image traditions the Dürer would have been familiar with, Italian and Northern. Starting in the 15th century, Italian artists emphasized Sebastian's ancient Roman origin by depicting him in contrapposto in classical setting, as is visible in Mantegna's painting in Vienna. As Mantegna does here, artists took depicting Sebastian as an opportunity to demonstrate their abilities to render an idealized nude male form. In the North, by contrast, as we can see in Hans Memling's Resurrection triptych, classical reference and idealization is absent. The role of the column is played by a tree, and the drapery by contemporary clothing. Sebastian is stripped to his underpants, his arms tied above his head, and like Christ in the same triptych, is depicted with leg hair. The difference between the two engravings, therefore, can easily be related to the cultural variation in image culture that we are all familiar with. Northern artists captured naturalistic detail, but not anatomical accuracy or convincing pictorial space, while Italian artists emphasized idealized, more accurately rendered anatomy, as well as the effective illusion of procession into space. More than this, however, the two engravings provide us with an opportunity to examine hairiness in the context of these image traditions. In a later confrontation of the naturalistic with the classical, Valentin de Boulogne's Allegory of Italy, the artist worked from one of his regular models, capturing not only his distinctive features, but also his richly furred chest. From these two examples, some 100 years apart, I will consider the role of body hair as not only an indicator of naturalism in contrast to classicism, but also as a challenge to the restrictions of the classical. The hair in both artworks exceeds and conceals the contours of the male body, suggesting the power of native masculinity to disrupt classical forms and pictorial norms. The role of the artwork's medium, as I will show, is vital in each depiction. First, a little bit on body hair. I'm sure we're going to hear this many times. Human adults have two kinds. the fine, light, vellus hair that covers most exposed skin except the palms of the hands, soles of the feet, and lips, and terminal hair, the thicker, darker hair found in distinct areas of the body, especially the armpits, groin, and legs. We now know terminal hair in both men and women to be the result of androgenic hormones that increase with puberty. In the humoral system of medicine that was dominant in the early modern period, however, male body and facial hair was believed to be a byproduct of the concoction of semen. The greater heat innate to the male body allowed this byproduct to be extruded through the pores as hair. Cold caused contraction of the pores, which explained the lesser amount of body hair on northerners and women, the latter of whom were understood to be innately cold. The presence of body hair in men was viewed as a sign of virility, and especially from the 16th century onward, beards became popular in adult males, and male pubic hair frequently appears in sculpture, as in Michelangelo's David and the many examples that we just saw. Male body hair lacks the negative connotation of female pubic hair, which was associated with sin. While portraits of men, especially in the 16th century, frequently lavish attention on beards, they do not often include body hair, if only because the chest, legs, and arms of sitters are generally covered with clothing. As a notable exception, the Dutch artist Carl Fabricius dared to depict chest hair peeping through a gap in his chemise in his 1645 self-portrait. Generally, however, the presence or absence of body hair is a question largely for the male figure in history and religious paintings, in which the naked or lightly dressed male body is more likely to appear. As Penny Howell-Jolly notes in her survey of body hair in late medieval art, Christ is one figure who is frequently shown with some body hair, likely in relation to expressing his human nature. In Italian and classically inflected painting, however, except for pubic hair, male figures are hairless, following the tradition of ancient Greek and Roman sculpture. The cause for hairlessness in ancient sculpture is twofold. One is that art reflects the reality that Greek athletes shaved their bodies. The apoxiomenos, or scraper, by the late classical sculptor Lysippus depicts a man using a strigil after exercising to remove dirt, the oil that he applied before his workout, and body hair except for pubic hair, which I think might be what Pat was alluding to. Another related reason is the classical style's emphasis on the unbroken exterior contour lines of the human body. Only Pappus Silenus, the senior form of the drunken companion of Dionysus, is typically depicted with copious gray or white body hair. Depiction of this hair resembles animal fur that blur his outline in interior contour lines. By contrast, the ideal classical male body is column-like, and the torso is contained in the cuirasse esthétique, an armor-like muscular carapace. In Mantegna's depiction of Sebastian, the columnar effect is accentuated by his blood-streaked body in relation to the streaky marble of the column behind him and the position of his feet on a base-like block of stone. Mantegna extends the architectural metaphor through the resemblance of the structure of the ribs around Sebastian's solar plexus to the nearby arch. As Linda Need argues, the classical body's internal and external structure enables an illusion of control over the body, a containment of the formless and therefore feminine matter of the male interior. The depiction or absence of body hair also has a relationship to the artist's procedures of making art. As Marianne Coase notes in her article on skin as medial metaphor, the term skin, pelle, was used repeatedly as a way of describing the final surface of an artwork in Italian technical literature, including Leon Battista Alberti's application of the term to painting. In a painting of flesh that conceals its brushstrokes, subsuming the artist's indexical presence for the purpose of greater illusion of skin, the surface of the painting shares not only in skin's hue, but also its texture. The smooth surface of sculpture similarly mimics hairless skin, replacing the reality of our fuzzy dermis with an idealized silken surface. When body hair is depicted, moreover, it not only offers an extra level of difficulty and effort in rendering the human form, adding a further step of representation, but also can actively compete with the methods of creating a successful illusion. In her survey of body hair, Howell-Jolly notes that she will be addressing, quote, only distinctly linear body hair rather than dark shading that could be hair, unquote, articulating this dilemma. Depicted individually in paintings, the small, thin lines of body hair resemble craquelure or even deforming marks across a surface. When it is generalized into a region of fuzz, body hair resembles modeling through chiaroscuro. Moreover, hair can be a location of particular artistic expression. In his didactic poem about art making, the Dutch artist, biographer, and theorist Carl van Mander included hair in a list of subjects that could not be depicted through instruction of the hand. As well as skies, leaves, and draped textiles, hair required making use of the face or spirit, the source of artistic images generated in the mind's eye. These diaphanous, motile, even spirit-like subjects could only be depicted through the collaboration of the spirit itself. As such, as in a painting such as Dürer's 1500 self-portrait, as Joseph Kerner notes, the trajectory of each slender hair of his beard refers to its own making with the delicate touch of the brush, itself a cluster of hairs. In contrast to painting and sculpture, the depiction of body hair in engravings is complicated by the line vocabulary that constructs the images. On one hand, the necessarily highly controlled movement of the burin through the surface of the copper aptly reproduces the taut contour lines of classical sculpture. Even the terminology for engraving, an artist claimed his work with the Latin past participle sculpsit, evokes the subtractive labor of sculpture. On the other hand, the short linear marks used to model the form inside the body can come close to looking like hair, as in Wenzel von Olmutz's Saint Sebastian. In his 1504 Adam and Eve, Dürer expands the type of marks to differentiate his form, using stipples and long parallel lines to model the play of light across the topography of the body. To clarify the difference from these marks, Adam's pubic hair blossoms above the leaves concealing his genitals, and a decorative sprinkle of hair appears between his pectorals. No further body hair appears to interrupt the surface at the edges of his body. Similarly, in Column Sebastian, albeit a similar image, the internal lines are geometric in their rigidity and firmly controlled within the contour of Sebastian's body. In Dürer's Tree Sebastian, by contrast, the exterior contour fails. In some places, the marks that are an extension of the cross contours, and in others, they are new lines that lie across the contour lines, as if to repeatedly cancel them. Sebastian's leg hair thus creates a sensation of both controlled and uncontrolled breaching of the classical decorum. The exterior contour line not only fails to contain his matter, but also the mark of the artist. The protrusion of these lines evokes the medical understanding of hair itself, residual matter pushing through the pores of the skin. Simultaneously referencing male virility and uncontrollable bodily forces, the hair on his legs transgresses the classical contour as much as his splayed legs defy the contrapostal pose. In the context of the Germanic format of the image and its naturalism, the leg hair embodies and enacts a native German resistance to the classical form. Divided by many decades and geography from Dürer's Sebastians, overt body hair again emerges in the context of classical figures in Valentin de Boulogne's Allegory of Italy. Commissioned by Cardinal Barberini, The large painting depicts a young woman representing Italy, standing above two male figures that represent the Tiber River on the left and the Arno on the right. While the Arno's degree of hairiness is ambiguous due to the shadows falling over him, the Tiber is patently hirsute. Both men relate to classical representations of river gods, such as those that were excavated in Rome in the 16th century. We are seeing the river Tiber here. He carries an oar to indicate the river's navigability, and despite his flowing hair and beard and curly puff of pubic hair in line with his classical origins, he is otherwise without hair. To embody his depiction of the river Tiber, Valentin uses an older male taking that same pose, but with flowing hair and a full beard. And he is familiar with from other paintings. He captures not only that specific man's bunions, but also his distinct pattern of chest hair. Valentin was part of the prominent contingent of painters working in the style inaugurated by Caravaggio in the 2 decades after his death in 1609. Known for its strong chiaroscuro and its naturalism, this style emphasized the grit and contingency of everyday life. Artist who adapted his style seems to have depicted body hair. The naturalistic style sits somewhat uneasily with the allegorical mode that became popular after the publication of the illustrated version of Cesare Ripa's Iconologia in 1603, in which people with different combinations of costumes, gestures, and props symbolized abstract concepts, and often, though not always, highly staged compositions. Simon Vouet's roughly contemporary artwork, Allegory of Peace, shows a more typical capitulation to the artificiality of the allegorical form, with idealized figures in a classical setting. Valentin's painting, by contrast, thanks to the chest hair, creates the effect of a tableau vivant with real actors. Sensitively rendered as it is, the hair nonetheless conceals the anatomy of the men's chest, covering the pectorals, fudging the line between his abdominals, and creating a vague darkness at his pubis, perhaps simply to preserve the modesty of his recognizable model. Especially seen with the river Arno's vague, shadowy suggestion of hair, the Tiber's hair feels like an overt infiltration of the enveloping shadows and dark background of the naturalistic style into the classical body. A roughly contemporary work by another painter in the naturalistic vein, The Flaying of Marsyas by Bartolomeo Manfredi, offers a figure for the normative control of the classical form. In punishment for showing him up in a musical competition, Apollo, the most classical of the classical gods, flays the satyr Marsyas. Manfredi depicts Apollo slicing through the satyr's skin at the contour of his arm, as if to reinforce it. Apollo is brightly lit, his flesh marmoreally white, in contrast to the darker skin of Marsyas, whose hairiness, soon to be removed along with his dermis, is suggested by his patchy beard, the frayed edge of his drapery, and the chest hair-shaped shadow that covers his torso. The hairy men in both of these artworks thus stand in opposition to the smooth skin decorum of the classical style as it was transmitted to the early modern period through ancient sculpture. Overt hairiness is thus a feature that artists depicted, if infrequently, as anathema to the classical. Hairiness is certainly an indicator of naturalism, but it is also a point of resistance to the transnational idealizing and normative nature of the classical style. In both artworks, this is enacted through overt masculinity that is linked to the local, whether through the northern style or a specific hyper-local model representing a native river. In both, the tools of resistance resemble those of the artist, not only to create volume through shading, but also to conceal and destroy.
So now we move on to our next paper. second week of this session, and I will present Amelia Pontifex, and she's a PhD candidate in art history at the University of Melbourne. And her doctoral research explores representations of non-normative and hirsute bodies in early modern European art, with a focus on gender, disability, and the visual politics of difference. She has taught also Renaissance art and art market at the University of Melbourne, and her paper, Birded Warnings, Morality, the Hirsute Female Body in Early Modern Art, examines Lavinia Fontana's portrait of Antonia Gonzalez as a case of managed exceptionality. So please, Amelia, the floor is yours.
Thank you to our hosts and colleagues here at the NIKI. Early modern viewers learn to read female facial hair through a moral lens. Sebastian de Covarrubias in Emblemus Moralis of 1610 gives a compact statement of that rule. His emblem, captioned to what translates to neither and both, combines image, motto, and epigram to fix meaning in advance. The bearded female face is presented as proof of inversion, and proof becomes warning. The pairing of picture with text directs the gaze before other readings are possible. Comparable treatments appear throughout the later 16th century in prodigy compilations, broadsides, and natural history practices. It is against this codified habit I turn to Lavinia Fontana's Antoinette Gonzalez, which in a newly surfaced Tokyo canvas rebuilds the viewer's reading from within inside the picture by anchoring identification at 3 sites, being the face, the ruff, and the letter. This presentation will examine the newly surfaced canvas acquired by the National Museum of Western Art in Tokyo in July of 2024, and the long-known version at the Musée de Beaux-Arts, Château de Blois. Thanks to a very recent study undertaken by Mr. Shinsuke Watanabe, the Tokyo Museum's technical and stylistic assessment identifies the Tokyo canvas as the autograph work and the Blois canvas as a close replication. On that footing, the central question is not a race for priority. It is how the autograph work and surface instructs looking, so the viewer meets a named child rather than a moralized type, and how that instruction is sustained in 3 zones that govern attention, being the face, the ruff, and the letter held in the sitter's hand. The Tokyo canvas measures 54.5 by 47 centimeters. Antoinette appears at half length against a dark background. A modest floral garland circles her head. The costume is somber and carefully described, with a structured bodice and high scalloped ruff that frames the face and neck. The sitter's hands hold a folded piece of paper whose text is legible within the fiction of the room. The inscription states the sitter's name, Antoinette. It cites her father, Petrus Gonzalez, identifies her as living in the court of Isabella Pallavicino, Marchese de Seraigna, and at the right margin carries the date, read as 1595. The inscription is not an external cartellino placed on the frame or margin. Identification here is embedded within the fiction of the room, but most significantly here, it is presented in Antoinette's own hands, written by her, and clearly states her own family lineage as a declaration of her origins. Ultraviolet-induced fluorescence shows an even greenish response, typical of an aged natural resin varnish. Small darker islands appear at 3 places that matter for legibility. Around the face and garland, around the presenting right hand, and along the creases and perimeter of the letter. Lead-rich passages in the ruff and on the folded paper exhibit low fluorescence and read cooler and duller, as expected of original paint films. Standard photographs show a thinly rubbed band along the picture's perimeter, where an earlier frame overlapped the paint, and slight differences in sheen around the right hand and letter, and a few smaller, darker, older fills at the lower edge of the paper and in the background. These are routine traces of age and minor maintenance. Near-infrared imaging shows no exploratory underdrawings and no shifts in the position of the eyes, the garland, or the letter. There is no sign of redesign. The face, the ruff, and the inscribed letter were laid in during the original painting, and later work is limited to tiny retouchings of losses to keep those passages readable. Reading the two canvases side by side, the Tokyo canvas at the top left and the Blois at the bottom left, the face tells a different story in each. In the Tokyo canvas, the nasal tip is rounded and fleshy, with the bridge to tip modeled by the firm transition, and nostril rims are fully drawn. The eyelids meet, and the outer and inner corners meet with continuous taut lines, and the catch lights are small and placed, so to hold the gaze. Hair on the cheeks and jaw is laid in short directional strokes that follow the head's turn, which ties the down to the underlying structure of the face. In the Blois canvas below, the nose resolves to a smaller pointed tip with a tight philtrum and drawn with a harsh vermilion line. The outer nostril edges soften, the eyelid line loses tension near the corners, and the catchlight spread, so the gaze reads as less controlled. The cheek hairs sit more as a soft veil over the surface. Early writers, including Ulisse Aldrovandi, likened her face to an unfledged bird, and the Blois version encourages that avian reading through the pointed nose, uniform down, and brighter, more feather-like continuous ruff. The Tokyo version reads more frankly mammalian, with a rounded, more fleshy nose, taut eyelids, and hair set in directional strokes, stresses fur and flesh. Yet those same decisions bind their hair to the head structure and keep a coherent human physiognomy. Blois softens and regularizes those features, encouraging a more idealized bird-like type. The Tokyo canvas keeps the tactile human animal texture, yet fixes an individual human likeness. Two other parts of the surface reinforce this point. In the Tokyo version, the rough scallops stay separate and countable as they pass under the chin, which steadies the head. And in the Blois version, they merge into larger arcs, and that framing weakens. In the Tokyo canvas, the letter is a specific object, straight lines, repeated creases, and the right margin date with readable text naming Antoinette, Petrus Gonzalez, Isabella Pallavicino, and 1595. Ultraviolet shows only small retouchings along the paper's creases and edges, consistent with preserving legibility. Near-infrared shows no trial lines or moved features in the eyes, nose, garland, or letter. Because of the features that anchor address, continuous eyelids, small placed catchlights, distinct nostril rims, a clean philtrum, and the reflected light under the chin sit in original paint, the likeness is intentional, not the result of later reworking. Cheek and jaw hair is laid in directional strokes that follow the head's turn, so the down belongs to the anatomy rather than floating like a mask. Taken together, the build is coherent and deliberate. The viewer meets a constructed physiognomy, not a pre-organized or pre-managed type, which is why the Tokyo canvas reads as a person rather than a type, a warning, or a moralized sign. If we now move to the ruff that frames the face, in the Tokyo detail, the top image, the scallops stay separate and countable as they pass under the chin, along the jaw. The alternation of light and shadow holds a regular rhythm around the curve, so the eye can follow the edge without confusion. In the Blois detail below, the scallops do not stay discrete. Along the jaw, they run together, so the edge resolves into broader, continuous arcs. The light-shadow alternation diffuses, and the spacing loses regularity. The result is functional. The Tokyo version actively sets and holds the face for the viewer. Blois arguably weakens that framing. Now to the letter. In early modern portraits, a sheet, pen, or stylus were often included to signal literacy and education without necessarily specifying the content. The writing is often blank, token, or displaced. Fontana does something different here, and the Tokyo canvas makes it explicit. The letter in her hands is fully readable inside the scene. It gives the sitter's Italian name, Antoinetta, links her to Petrus Gonzalez, Don Pietro, her father, places her in the household of Isabella Pallavicino, Marchese de Sardegna, and carries a right margin date read as 1595. Those four elements, name, lineage, household, date, fix origins and personhood inside the image. The paper behaves like a handled object. The right edge is straight, the lower edge casts a small shadow on the bodice, and two diagonal creases repeat across the sheet in line with the grip of the fingers. Set against this, the Blois sheet moves towards a template. The perimeter softens into the ground. The crease geometry is less resolute. The cast shadow weakens, and at normal viewing distance, the script loses determination. The Tokyo version functions here as a portable certificate, a document that states who she is, whose child she is, where she belongs, and where the likeness was made, and the Blois canvas arguably is a weaker sense and functions as a prop that signals literacy without securing identity. This makes the Tokyo version therefore hold more of Antoinette's origins and secures her personhood in the frame, as it more clearly anchors name, kinship, social placement, and date within the fiction of the room at the exact points where the viewer looks. Letters between Milan and Bologna trace Antoinette's likeness and how it moved from court to cabinet between the 22nd of November, 1592, and the 23rd of May, 1593. A correspondent signing Brumano wrote from Milan to Ulisse Aldrovandi that a portrait of Femina Selvatica, meaning wild woman, or hirsute female, has been sent from the Duke of Parma to Isabella Pallavicino. He undertook to obtain a likeness for Aldrovandi and reported efforts to have a copy made in Milan by the hand of the very capable young woman. The Marchese is then documented in Bologna with Antoinette between the 3rd and the 9th of April, 1594, with a meeting recorded with Aldrovandi during that visit. The Tokyo inscription repeats the same courtly triad of Antoinette, Petrus Gonzalez, Isabella Pallavicino, and the right margin date read as 1595. Read together, the letter and the inscription give a concrete sequence. 1, a court gift from Parma to Soragna. 2, an attempted Milan replication to satisfy Aldrovandi's request. 3, a Soragna to Bologna visit in April 1594 that provided access to the sitter in Fontana's orbit. And 4, soon after, a finished canvas whose internal text stated name, lineage, household, and date. Within Aldrovandi's practice, portraits and drawings were handled as specimens, copied into dossiers, entered in lists, and prepared for print with categorical captions that retyped persons as examples. The version of Antoinette that entered print in the 1642 Monstrum Historia, a woodcut by Giovanni Battista Coriolano, does not reproduce Fontana's on-canvas self-identification. The figure is presented for reading by the external caption and taxonomy, not by any inside text inside the scene. In this woodcut, the caption reads, "A hairy girl, 12 years old." The child is set amongst rocks and sparse plants, as if emerging from a grotto or wilderness. is rendered in coarse, parallel hatch across the cheeks and jaw, while the dress remains courtly, creating a clear nature-culture tension. There is no self-identifying letter. Identity is supplied from outside the image, and the result is typologizing rather than individualizing. The garland reads more as a domestic wreath. The small, bell-shaped white sprays of lily of the valley, a late spring Marian flower associated with humility and purity, frames Antoinette with innocence rather than progeny. The serrated, tufted petals are consistent with dianthus, pink carnations, which in portrait practice signals familial and maternal affection, and in devotional usage, the incarnation and maternal bond. Here, it anchors the child in a household care. The trifoliate leaves read as clover, a conventional sign of the Trinity and of good fortune in secular usage, which folds bodily difference into traditional belief and a domestic well-being. Together, these modest field flowers soften the transition at the temples, keeping attention on the eyes and support the picture's claim to personhood. They reinforce identification, but the instruments of identification remains the coordinated work of the face, the ruff, and the letter. The moralizing tradition is secure. Emblem books and related prints taught viewers to treat bearded female faces as a warning, with text and image locking the body into a lesson. Fontana's Antoinette Gonzalez breaks that rule by relocating meaning inside the scene and by directing looking into three specific focal sites. The face holds address because its construction endures continuous eyelid lines, placed catch lights, distinct nostril rims, and hair strokes directly moved with the turned face. The ruff frames the address, and its scallops remain separate and countable as they pass under the chin, keeping the head steady for recognition. The letter functions as a document and proof of identity as it remains legible within the room, with its edges, creases, and cast shadows acting as a handled object and practical tool rather than a prop. The Tokyo surface preserves these procedures with the greatest clarity. The Blois surface repeats them, arguably with softer control at the same points. The contribution here is precise, as the portrait does not deny bodily difference. It stabilizes personhood in paint, so the image can cross rooms and still resist reduction to a type. The claims are testable on the surface. Count the ruff, follow the eyelid lines to the corners, read the right margin date, and check under UV and near infrared that later works sit where handling wears the paint and not where identity is stated. Viewers here meet a name, a household, and a carefully observed face before any inherited moralizing can be applied. Thank you.
So now we move on to our last paper before the lunch break, and it will be delivered by Elisa Stafferini. Elisa Stafferini recently completed her PhD at the Warburg Institute, where she defended her thesis, Women in Arms, Female Warriors in Italian Art 1500-1700, which was supported by the Sachsen-Gombrich Scholarship. Her research investigates the representation of warrior women in early modern Italian art with a broader interest in the intersections of gender, politics, and visual culture. Before her doctoral studies, she earned her BA and MA with summa cum laude from La Sapienza, Università di Roma, and she held fellowships at the University of Oxford, the Kunsthistorisches Institut in Florence, and the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa. From her publications, I just mentioned that one in the volume A Driving Force on the Rhetoric of Images and Power, Gendered Allegories of Power and Warfare, Warrior Women as Personifications in Early Modern Art. And her talk today will develop thoughts on one of these very hairy warriors, female warriors, and we are very curious. Please join me in welcoming Amelia.
Thank you, Mathilda and Mandy, for organizing this wonderful conference, and for the people who already spoke. They were very interesting talks. Okay. In a 1403 manuscript of the Claret Noble 10, French translation of Boccaccio's De Mulieribus Claris, amid the images of noble and virtuous women dressed in sumptuous brocades and elaborate headdresses, appears an anomaly, a miniature portraying a wild, hirsute female figure. The scene shows a woman whose hair cascades from her head down across her shoulders, back, hips, and legs. She stands barefoot in a forested landscape, grasping a spear in one hand and a javelin in the other. Judging from her blood-stained weapon, she has just wounded a deer that leaps to the left of the composition, blood streaming from its thigh. At her feet lies a stag, bleeding and near death. The figure represents Camilla, the warrior maiden from Virgil's Aeneid. In this paper, we'll explore why this image stands out as an exception on several levels. First, within the context of this particular manuscript. Second, within the wider corpus of early 15th century copies of the Mulieribus Claris. And third, within the broader visual tradition of Camilla's representation from the late medieval to the early modern period. These layers of exceptionality invite us to reconsider how medieval artists and patrons understood Camilla's story, and to ask whether her image could embody virtue, savagery, and heroism simultaneously. But before addressing these broader questions, it is essential to begin with the source text itself, the Aeneid, and the figure of Camilla as Virgil conceived her. Camilla does not appear in any classical sources outside Virgil's poem. She is almost certainly his invention, combining traits of earlier mythological figures, such as the swift huntress Atalanta and the Amazon queen Penthesilea. She first enters the Aeneid in Book 7 as the Queen of the Volscians, one of the Italian peoples allied with King Turnus against the Aeneas and the Trojans, seeking to settle in Italy. At this stage, Virgil presents her as a chaste and athletic queen who has adapted her hunting skills for war, aided by her quasi-divine speed. Virgil expands her story in Book 11, where Camilla re-emerges as a central protagonist. Her life is narrated by the goddess Diana, to whom she is devoted. The episodes from Camilla's life are illustrated here through scenes from the fresco frieze painted by Niccolò dell'Abate around 1550 in the Palazzo Poggi, Bologna. This frieze is a crucial visual source, not only for its close adherence to Virgil's narrative, but also because it constitutes the most extensive artistic treatment of Camilla's story. I will briefly return to it later to compare it with our manuscript. In Book 11 of the Aeneid, Diana recounts that Camilla was the daughter of Metabus, king of the Volscians, who, after being deposed for his tyranny, fled with his infant daughter as his sole companion. Pursued by the Volscian army and blocked by the river Amazinus, Metabus tied the baby to a spear and prayed to Diana to save her, dedicating the infant to the goddess as her handmaiden. The child of an exiled father and an absent mother, mentioned by Virgil only in passing, Camilla was nursed on the milk of a wild mare. She grew up in the wilderness, armed and trained by her father in archery and hunting. Virgil even tells us that a tiger's pelt hung over her head and down her back instead of a gold clasp for her hair and a long trailing robe. Diana never explains how Camilla became queens of the Volscians, the same people who had once exiled her father. She merely laments that Camilla was drawn into war, for she had previously been content with Diana alone, cherishing a lifelong unsullied devotion for her weapons and her maidenhood. When she entered the conflict against the Trojans, the huntress transformed herself into a warrior, a bellatrix. Following Diana's account of her youth, Virgil describes Camilla's participation in battle, brief but remarkable. She is presented as a triumphant Amazon with one breast bared for combat. In the Palazzo Poggi fresco, just like in the Aeneid, her deeds on the battlefield are the most extensive. She fights courageously against the Trojan allies, inflicting many casualties. Yet, at a crucial moment, Camilla is distracted by the gleaming armor of Clorius, a priest of Cybele, and becomes cieca et incauta, blind and reckless. Virgil tells us that she pursues Chloreus, intent either on dedicating his armor to a temple or adorning herself with the captured gold. The same dreadful virgin, or Renda Virgo, who had inspired the terror among warriors, succumbs to what Virgil calls a woman's love for booty and spoils. In her distraction, she is fatally ambushed and struck in the breast by a minor character. This is what we learn about Camilla from the Aeneid. Our illumination, however, comes, as previously mentioned, from a French translation of Giovanni Boccaccio's De Mulieribus Claris, a text with a very different moral framework. De Mulieribus Claris, written in the late 14th century, is a collection of 106 biographies of women from ancient mythology, legend, and history, extending up to Boccaccio's own time. It inaugurated a highly influential genre of female biography, inspiring many later authors, including Filippo Foresti, Giovanni Sabatino degli Arienti, Giuseppe Betussi, and Francesco Serdonati. The Latin title translates as On Famous Women, but as Boccaccio explains in the preface, fame does not necessarily equate with virtue. He writes, "It is not my intention to interpret the word famous in such a strict sense that it will always appear to mean virtues. Instead, with the kind permission of my readers, I will adopt a wider meaning and consider as famous those women who have gained a reputation throughout the board for any deed whatsoever." This raises an important question, which also informs our interpretation of the miniature. Camilla, a woman who grows up in the wilderness, becomes a warrior and slays many Trojans, can be considered virtuous, or is she merely famous? Boccaccio opens Camilla's biography with the phrase, "Camilla, Queen of the Volscians, was an illustrious maiden worthy of memory." It is precisely this emphasis on maidenhood that signals Camilla as virtuous. We will investigate how Boccaccio, compared to Virgil, amplifies this aspect of her biography. Yet, following Virgil closely, it does not negate her militancy. On the contrary, whereas Virgil dismisses Camilla's battlefield destruction as the potential product of feminine vanity, Boccaccio simply writes that she died in the midst of the pursuits she had loved. In the miniature, however, Camilla appears not as a warrior, but as a huntress. The focus is on her early part of the life, before she enters the battlefield, when, as Boccaccio writes, she began to cover her body with the skins of animals, to hurl a spear, use a slingshot, stretch the bow, wear a quiver, chase and catch deer and wild goats, and disdain all womanly work. Even in this passage, Boccaccio signals her exceptionality. Camilla grows up on the margins of civilization, mastering pursuits traditionally deemed inappropriate for women. Yet, potentially surprisingly, this negation of conventional femininity is not presented negatively. As it often happens in this text, Camilla, by becoming more virile, becomes closer to men, a gender widely considered superior by Boccaccio. I previously noted that this miniature is exceptional on 3 levels. Within this manuscript, among illuminated French translations of De Mulieribus Claris, and within the broader visual tradition of Camilla. Let us begin by comparing it with other images from the same work. The manuscript was presented to John Duc de Berry by his valet Jean Lavar in February 1404, placing its creation around 1403, just 2 years after the French translation of Boccaccio's text. It was illustrated by the artist known as the Master of the Noble Women of the Duc de Berry, a name derived from this very manuscript. The artist, of Flemish origin, collaborated with several assistants, some responsible for coloring, others contributing distinctive stylistic touches. In this manuscript, 107 miniatures depict women, some containing multiple figures, for a total of about 165 female figures by my count. Almost all appear as courtly ladies, lavishly dressed and elaborately coiffed. Many wear crowns and jewels. Among the exceptions are Rea Ilia, a Vestal shown with her head covered, resembling a nun, Pompeia Paulina, depicted in the nude after her attempted suicide, and Camilla, the only wild woman in the entire manuscript. Camilla's exceptionality becomes even more striking when compared to other female warriors. While the text celebrates these women for their virility and martial prowess, they are represented in the miniatures wearing elaborate 15th century garments hardly suitable for combat. The Amazon queens, Oryzia and Antiope, go to war in helmets, yet wear long ornamented gowns. Penthesilea, another Amazon queen, rides side saddle among her companions, crowned and richly dressed. Tomyris, queen of the Scythian, though portrayed as a vengeful killer, is represented in a four-trimmed gown wearing a crown above her helmet. Hypsicratea, queen of Pontus, follows her husband onto the battlefield. Boccaccio tells us that since female attire was not appropriate for such a task, she cut her hair, donned armor, and disguised her face with dust and rust. In this miniature, Hypsicratea is indeed showing cutting her hair, yet her disguise as a man is far from convincing. Let's just say that with her long, tight orange-red dress decorated with gold details, she wouldn't have fooled anyone on the front line. Perhaps, however, the most striking comparison is with the biography of Zenobia, Queen of Palmyra, who, just like Camilla, becomes a warrior after a life spent in the wilderness. Boccaccio writes that Zenobia, from childhood, scorned all womanly occupations and, having toughened her body, her young body, lived in forests and groves, girded with a quiver, hunting and killing goats and stags with her arrows. He adds that she roamed mountains and ravines, sleeping rough and exploring the lairs of wild beasts. Like Camilla, Zenobia is therefore shown as a huntress, holding a bow and surrounded by trees and animals. Yet, unlike Camilla, she appears as a courtly lady, her garments untouched by the hardship that she endured. A comparison between our miniature and others in the same collection shows that the imagery is not always consistent. Even two huntresses with similar backgrounds can be depicted in considerably different ways. It is therefore useful to examine other representations of Camilla in French manuscripts of the Claire Noble Femme produced in the same period. Here we see four miniatures of Camilla, all from early 15th century French manuscripts. Scholars have suggested that the first three, shown here in chronological order, derive from a shared visual model, while the fourth closely resembles the third, both in composition and in the attributes assigned to the figure. Although all four scenes portray Camilla as a huntress, the third and fourth adhere most closely to the text. Camilla appears partly naked, covered by what could be interpreted as animal skins, as described by Boccaccio. The first image comes from a manuscript given to Philip the Bold only a few years earlier than the one we are examining. It shows Camilla in the same posture as in our example. She holds the spear aloft in her right hand and the sling in her left, with the animals arranged in a similar way within the scene. There are, however, also some differences. In the earlier image, Camilla wears a crown and a golden belt, and her garment, though airy, appears tailored, perhaps made from animal hides, yet designed to emphasize her upright, courtly bearing. Brigitte Buetner, who has closely analyzed this manuscript, suggests that this miniature should be understood within its social context, as it emphasizes hunting as a princely occupation. Indeed, since 1397, hunting had become an exclusive privilege of the upper classes, when Charles VI restricted it to members of the nobility, the clergy, and the wealthy bourgeoisie. Representing Camilla as a member of the elite does not contradict the text. After all, she is the daughter of the king of the Volscians and will become a queen herself. What is instead revealing is that this manuscript, by giving Camilla a fancy dress and a golden belt, omits an aspect that appears at the end of her biography, namely her asceticism, an element crucial for understanding our miniature and to which I shall return later. When we turn to later visual interpretations of Camilla, the contrast is even more striking. Although she was never particularly popular subject, later depictions, whether inspired by Boccaccio's similarity with Clarius or by Virgin's Aeneid, shift the focus away from her wild upbringing, concentrating instead on her infancy or militancy or both. She's often shown either tied to the spear by her father as a baby or fighting and dying heroically on the battlefield. In the images in which she fights, Camilla wears either armor, it's either medieval or Roman lorica, that closely fits her body, or an Amazonian-style tunic that leaves one breast bare. These later visual traditions, including those of Palazzo Poggi, present Camilla as a chaste yet desirable warrior, virile in spirit but not devoid of femininity. Needless to say, no other artists represent her as a hirsute woman. Why then did the illuminator of this manuscript choose to portray Camilla as a savage figure? The simpler explanation might be that the artist associated her upbringing on the margins of civilizations with a wild animal-like body, yet other visual or textual factors might have influenced this choice. The first question to ask is whether this depiction might stem from a mistranslation of the text. We cannot be certain that the illuminators themselves actually read the work. However, as Florence has shown in her doctoral research, the imagery in this manuscript often follows the French translation very closely, reproducing its addition and errors rather than adhering to the Latin source. This suggests that whoever devised the iconographic program was indeed familiar with the French version. However, the illumination in question does not reflect any mistranslation. Both the French and Latin texts specify that Camilla wore animal skins, with no mention of body hair. If we assume that the designer of the imagery knew the text, an important distinction emerges between Camilla and the other huntress in the manuscript, Zenobia. We say that both grew up in the wilderness, both reject feminine occupations, and both remain virgins, traits that set them apart and prepare them for the transformation into warriors. Yet, Camilla alone is said to have been nursed on the milk of wild animals. The motive of the child nursed by beasts was well known, a literary topos often associated with heroes and saints. It appears throughout classical myth and medieval romance as the wild child motif. As Finn Sinclair observes in Blood and Milk, Gender and Genealogy in the Chanson de Geste, medieval thought often linked breast milk to the child's future moral and physical nature. Animal breastfeeding specifically implied a kind of animalization, a contamination through which the child acquired a heroic surplus or even superhuman qualities. Among the many medieval examples of such figures, an interesting one is that of Valentina d'Orson, a romance associated with the Carolingian cycle, which tells of twin brothers abandoned in the woods in infancy. Valentine is raised as a knight, while Orson grows up in a bear's den, becoming a wild man of the woods, his body covered in hair. The motive of animal breastfeeding was as much a literal trope as a visual one. In the biography of Rhea, the mother of Romulus and Remus, although the text does not refer to the she-wolf's milk that nursed the twins, the miniature shows them being suckled by the animal. If associated to that of these figures, Camilla's wildness is not monstrous, it is just another sign of her exceptional nature. It should be specified, however, that in this manuscript, the way people are represented, their gestures, attributes, and attire, is not applied consistently in a positive or negative sense. An example of this is in the biography of Nikaula, Queen of Ethiopia. Boccaccio writes that she is more worthy of remembrance since her splendid moral virtues had their origin among uncivilized people. In Latin, these uncivilized folks are referred to as barbari and incultores. The French translator, however, adds the word bestiaux to describe them. Accordingly, in the miniature, Nikaula is shown beside two hirsute men representing the barbarous inhabitants of Ethiopia. The miniatures, therefore, must be read in relation both to the text and to the manuscript as a whole. Hirsuteness, as the examples of Camilla and Nikaula show, does not carry a fixed or uniformed meaning. Another possible explanation for Camilla's hirsuteness might lie in a deeper difference between virgins and Boccaccio's portrayals. It's the most significant one. In the Aeneid, the term Virgo, maiden, is the epithet most frequently attached to Camilla. Furness calls her Decus Italia Virgo, Virgin Glory of Italy. She is described as Aspera Virgo, the first maiden, and even her blood is termed virginal. Yet, Virgil dwells little on her chastity. Only once, through Diana's words, does he mention that Camilla, devoted to the goddess, rejected marriage and valued her maidenhood. If we compare this brief passage to the long description of her battlefield exploits, it is clear that the defining trait of Virgil's Camilla is her militancy, or at least that her martial prowess is what merits extended attention in the poem. Boccaccio, by contrast, amplifies the theme of chastity. He tells us that Camilla mocked her youthful admirers and refused every offer of marriage, details absent from the Aeneid. More importantly, he concludes her biography with an explicitly moralizing passage. I wish that the girls of our time would consider Camilla's example when they imagine this mature and self-possessed young woman wearing a quiver and running freely through the open fields, forests, and the lairs of animals, constantly curbing wanton desire with its enticements, refusing the pleasures and luxury of elaborate food and drink, and steadfastly rejecting not only the embraces, but even the conversation of young women of her own age. This emphasis on self-restraint and ascetic virtue, absent from Virgil, brings Camilla closer to the figure of the ascetic saints, such as Mary of Egypt or Mary Magdalene, who in that period were also commonly represented as hirsute women and continue to be depicted in this manner in later images. In the absence of documentation, this connection must remain speculative. However, it is a plausible one, especially considering the numerous other clares femmes composition appropriate models derived from Christian iconography. Brigitte Buiten has examined the recycling of Christian motifs in the context of the earlier manuscript, the one presented to Philippe the Bold. She suggests that the pervasive use of Christian framework in the images of claire femme might have functioned as a strategy of legitimization, lending moral authority and credibility to the material, a crucial concern in the context of manuscripts populated by female subjects. A degree of visual intertextuality in this depiction is to be expected. The artist faced a challenging task. While some of these women had established visual traditions, others did not, and therefore had to be imagined anew. Camilla belongs to the latter category. The intertextuality of her miniature operates on two levels. On one hand, it evokes the mythological or literal wild woman. On the other, it draws from the imagery of the ascetic saint. It is the text that conveys the meaning, that tells us that Camilla is an illustrious maiden worthy of memory, so that even her hirsute appearance can be read as a mark of virtue. But the meaning of the image does remain partially ambiguous and is likely open to multiple interpretation, just as it must have been for its contemporary viewers.